Welcome to Confessions of a Parent Coach. I'm parent coach, mother of four, and your host, Ann Kaplan. This is the podcast where you will learn that even for parenting experts like me, there is no such thing as a perfect parent, and that fabulous behavior and amazing relationships are right on the other side of that realization. If you're working your butt off to do right by your kid, honor yourself, and go beyond the BS around you, you are my person, and this podcast is for you. Welcome into another episode of the podcast, listeners. I'm excited to be here with you again this week, talking about something that has just been cropping up all over the place in my practice recently. And I'm starting to, I know you've heard me say this before on the podcast, but it really does feel like there's like themes that are just sort of like floating around in the zeitgeist at all times. And they just, then for a while, I'll just be like riding this wave of something that like energetically all of my clients are exploring, and maybe also I'm exploring personally, like in all these different ways and stuff. And so I decided to make a podcast episode about it and talking about, if you go back, back into the archives of the podcast, you can find so many great episodes about boundaries and how it's super important boundaries and why it's important boundaries and what it means when we hold boundaries and all of that great stuff. And I think today's episode is just going to be like another step forward in that same sort of arena of talking about boundaries. But I really want to talk about, I'm going to purposely use the D word today, which is discipline, instead of the more maybe like comfortable word of boundaries, even though we're really talking about the same thing. When we talk about loving limits, when we talk about holding boundaries, when we talk about taking care of ourselves as much as we take care of other people, when we talk about, discipline with love, when we talk about, the specific brand of love and logic, for example, when we talk about authoritative parenting, we talk about control and leadership in the context of authoritative parenting. We're really talking about the same thing, which is the need that kids have for the grownups to be in charge when it is a situation is beyond their capacity or above their pay grade. And so I'm going to be using the D word a lot today because I have been working a lot with some clients who know that that's an area they want to grow in, but they also really also know that it's a struggle for them, that they associate the idea of discipline with being mean or heartless or uncaring to their children. And I'm going to talk today more about why we do authoritative parenting. Why do we really continue to talk about that being the gold standard of parenting? And just to refresh your memory, or if it's your first time listening to the podcast, to orient you to what does it mean when we say authoritative parenting? What that means is that we are doing two things. And if you listen to the podcast, you're probably saying them with me right now. We have emotional attunement to our child, and we have control and leadership in the relationship. So kids need both of those things. Authoritative parenting means that we're doing both of those things. We're attuning to our kids. We have a lot of emotional intelligence and connection to them emotionally and awareness of their emotions. And we are setting boundaries. We are disciplining. We are using discipline in our parenting. Authoritative parenting means emotional attunement and discipline. Okay. And we're going to talk today, I'm going to use like lots of different examples of to illustrate how important and why it's important and what happens when we don't have discipline in our parenting, which is why this podcast is called The Hidden Cost of Permissive Parenting. Because right, if we have a lot of that emotional attunement, but we don't have discipline, we are permissive parents. If we have lots and lots of discipline without emotional attunement, we are not authoritative parents. We are authoritarian parents. Those are the sort of like punitive, dictatory kind of drill sergeant kind of parents, right? So today we're going to talk about discipline, why it's so important, and what is that hidden cost of permissive parenting. And as always, got to start with a confession. So I'm going to talk about me and my relationship with discipline and authoritative parenting. So my confession for you is that all of the stuff that I'm about to teach you in my early years of parenting, I did not give two craps about, and I didn't really even see the value of, or not that I didn't see the value of it, but I didn't see it as more important than, or as important as just managing my kids' behavior. So my early years of parenting were all about managing my kids' behavior. Even when I was doing parenting right, so I was doing authoritative parenting and I was non-punitive. I was really attuned to my kids. So I had both. I had the discipline and the emotional attunement. Really, like, the motive for me was still about getting my kids to be well behaved and really not a whole lot more. And you're going to see as I go forward in today's episode why I consider that a confession. And as I parented my kids this way, I could see like these little like connections were happening in my brain as I was observing, the impact of parenting this way. I could see that it was that kind of parenting was helping their self-esteem, and it was really helping our relationship, and it was creating this like healthy self-concept and fostering their sense of like sort of inner okayness in the world. I saw all that stuff, but if I'm honest, that was just like a bonus. What I really wanted was for my home to not be chaotic, for my kids to be well behaved, and for, my life to not just be like a total shit show. So, I didn't have any bigger picture than that. And this is something that I have been toying around with a lot lately in my own personal self. And then also as I'm watching my clients navigate parenting, like wondering, like, is it even possible to have that bigger picture when our kids are younger? Like, I don't know the answer to that. It's just something I've been toying around with, because if you think about, like you think about the natural arc of a person's development, which, continues through their whole life, and it is definitely far from complete when they have kids. Most parents are in a chapter of their own development where they are really rigidly identified with their ego, their personality construct, and this idea that we can control the world around us and stuff like that. And if you want to know more about what I'm talking about there, I talked about this back in September of 2025 in episode 134. And I think the title of that episode is something like, why don't I work with 20 something clients, or why I don't have a lot of 20 something clients. And that's an episode where I really talked about this like arc of development that I'm referring to here. But for today's conversation, just to say, like, when you take into consideration that that's just kind of where we are in that arc of development when we have kids, and you combine that with just the sheer chaos and logistical, mountain that is raising young kids, like, is it even reasonable to expect a parent in that moment of their life to be able to keep the big picture in mind, this like higher North Star reason for parenting authoritatively, or to expect them to see their parenting as really actually having nothing to do with their kids' behavior? I mean, that's a tall order. So I've been toying around with all of that stuff, and I don't know, like, is it possible for us to parent, like to be in that chapter of parenting and still be in this like high state of consciousness about it? I don't know. To be able to hold that esoteric theoretical idea and the nitty gritty day to day of like blue cup or red cup, or, whatever, like I said, it's a tall order. And you know what? At least in my case, it's almost an irrelevant question, because, things unfold the way they're meant to. And so in my case, they obviously were meant to unfold the way that they did, which was that I did not have the consciousness I have now at 46 back when I was 25 and raising my first little kid. So, so yeah, like the truth is I wasn't thinking about that big picture. And even when I got these little really beautiful gifts to like be like, oh, I can see how this is like doing really cool things for my kid, I still didn't even put that, as on a more important priority than keeping my house clean or making sure my kids weren't jerks, or, that I could live with them and stuff like that. So, that's just the truth. That's just who I was and where I was at that time of life. And if you're there too, like, yeah, you're in good company. And like I said, I'm starting to suspect that I think all of parents are in that space. I mean, maybe if you were 50 when you had your first kid, you would have a different perspective or something. But, most of us are in our like mid to late 20s or early 30s when we have our kids, maybe mid 30s. But even so, like, there's a lot of sort of just dropping down into the quagmire of parenting that happens when we are in those early years of parenting, that even if you have reached this like heightened state of consciousness at some point in your life, I don't know if you have access to it in the heat of the moment while you're parenting. So anyway, we're going to talk about that and circle back to that as today's episode goes on. So I want to kind of show you or tell you a story about a client that I'm working with, to kind of illustrate what really inspired me to start, musing about this and bringing it forward in my coaching with lots of clients. And, this is a unique client situation for me because every once in a while I work with a client who has information or documentation about what was going on in their parenting, from years back. So I actually get to see this like long picture of, oh, okay, so when this kid was 2 years old, here are some parenting situations that happened and how this parent handled them. And now here I am working with this parent when their kid is 7 years old, and I get to see these parenting situations and how my client is handling them. That's not always the case, but every once in a while, for whatever reason, a client will have that information and share it with me. So I get this like really long, almost like historical perspective on this client's parenting. And it's a real gift. And that is the case with this client that I'm about to tell you about. So I had, documentation from when her kiddo was, I think he was about a year and a half or 2 years old. And, in that documentation, one instance was described in there where, the kiddo, it was time for bed. It was time for nap time. Mom puts kiddo back to go to nap time. And 2 minutes later, the kiddo runs out of his room and is back running around the house. And then, mom's like, oh, well, like, never mind, and then, later on, the kiddo is like sitting in his high chair and, it's time to eat. Kid throws all his food on the floor and then just starts running around the house. And mom's kind of like, oh, well, I guess this is what we're doing now. And so, just lots of little instances where mom's doing a great job, like not getting upset, being loving and attentive to her child, like all of this stuff. But she's also not taking control or taking charge of these parenting moments where she knows her kiddo is tired, or she knows that it's really important that we have dinner now or whatever. Right. So we have this exact scenario that I'm describing of kiddo who has lots of love, lots of awareness of who he is, and all of that emotional intelligence being brought to the parenting relationship, but really not a whole lot of control and leadership. We don't have that discipline going on. And if you look at that 2-year-old, those 2-year-old examples, and ask yourself, well, like, who's in charge of this situation? Who's in charge of the nap time arrangement, or who's in charge of the mealtime arrangement? The kiddo's in charge. And there's lots of reasons why that might happen and even seem like the right thing to do. Well, the child's not tired, so we'll let the child decide. And, all of these things, there's lots of different philosophies out there. You're just going to hear today why, in my opinion, from my philosophy and lots of other parenting experts' philosophies, this isn't what we would recommend. So fast forward 5 years later, now I'm working with this mom, and she's got a 7-year-old, and he's a delightful child in so many ways. He's incredibly precocious, very loving, a sweet kid, very friendly and gregarious, and he's got a lot of stuff going for him. But he also struggles with some anxiety, in social interactions, both with adults and with kids his own age. He can be very controlling and bossy. And especially socially, he feels a lot of like agitation or worry that people are going to embarrass him or judge him or whatever. He gets very anxious. And you can see that when he gets anxious in any situation, he gets anxious, and not just social situations, he becomes more bossy and more controlling. And so I had a conversation with this parent because classic scenarios happen to all of us. Get to school in the morning, kiddo's forgotten his backpack. Happens to the best of us so many times, right? And mom said, well, go into school. You won't have your backpack at first, but luckily I'm able to go back to the house and get your backpack for you. So I'm going to bring it back to you. So we're not going to talk about whether or not she should have done that or not, that she's the mom. That's the choice she made. It felt good to her, but she was effectively setting a boundary when she said that. She said, go into the school. You won't have your backpack, but I'm going to go grab it and I'll bring it back to you and you'll have it in like an hour or something like that. And this kiddo just totally disintegrated. It was too anxiety provoking for him. The idea of going into school without his backpack. And what if the teacher said something? What if the kids noticed that he didn't have his backpack? And he did his classic habit, which is to say, I'm going with you. I'm not going to the school without my backpack. I'd rather be late. I'm going to be late and we'll go back to the house together, get the backpack, and then come here. I'm not going to the school without my backpack. And very upset, very, very just stressed, extremely worried, all of those things. And, just like when he was 2 years old and decided not to take a nap or decided not to eat his dinner, he got to decide that he wasn't going to go to school. And mom took him home and got the backpack, and then he went back to school. And later on we have a session together, we're talking about this, and wondering like, well, how can I support my kiddo when he's so anxious, and what does this kiddo need in order to not freak out this way, and and not have these like little panic moments around, doing something wrong or being called out or showing up, not exactly the way you want to present yourself to the world and things like that, which is a common challenge for him. And he really was panicked about it. So part of it was him trying to take control of the situation and say, I'm not going in, we're going back to the house. This is what we're going to do. But it all started from him being super anxious. And this was the like, kind of like, I got to make a podcast episode about this moment for me, because it is so rare that somebody would come to me with an anxiety kiddo and be thinking probably the solution to this kid's anxiety is more discipline. I would never expect a mom or a dad or any parent to, make that conclusion. Maybe if they're like a parenting expert and they work in the world of child psychology or something. But any normal person who sees another person in distress, our first inclination is not to think that person needs more discipline in their life. I need to hold a boundary with that person right now. We would think, oh my gosh, my heart is breaking for you. You're obviously extremely dysregulated. What can I do? How can I help? How can I help you feel more calm? And as I think you know where I'm going with this, as today's episode unfolds, I think you're going to actually see, I hope that you're going to see and agree with me that what actually is needed is discipline, even though that's not our sort of like default thought about that. So let's unpack this. And I'm going to bring it back to authoritative parenting. And when I was writing out my notes for today's episode, I was like, these people who listen to my podcast should be starting a drinking game where every time I say the word authoritative, you have to drink. Every time I say boundaries, you have to drink. When I say self, when I say parts, when I say a need, and you could get like points for it. We could have confessions of a parent coach bingo cards or something. But yeah, I don't care. I don't care how many times you've heard me say it before. I'm still going to do it. I'm bringing it back to my favorite buzzword, authoritative parenting. So the first point I want to make about this is the reason why we parenting experts say that authoritative parenting is the gold standard is actually not because it encourages kids to be well behaved or to be more pleasant to be around. Although it does do that. It absolutely does improve our children's behavior. But that's what's nice for the parent about authoritative parenting. It makes parenting more doable. It makes parenting more enjoyable, which is flipping awesome. And like I said in my confession, that 100% full transparency. That is 100% the reason why I chose to do it. It had nothing to do with anything about my kid. It had everything to do about, I need these kids to like rein it in or I'm going to lose my mind. And if that's you, absolutely no judgment. But it's not like a bunch of parenting experts decided to recommend this kind of parenting because we want to make life easier for parents. No, the reason that we all talk about authoritative parenting is because it's good for the child. It's literally what they need, not just in order to be well behaved, but to just be well. And in order for kids to develop that secure sense of self and healthy attachment, they need loving limits as much as they need emotional attunement. And that's why when I was a kid, I feel like I was a kid when I look back on it, but I was an adult. But that's why when I started using this kind of parenting, when my kids were young and I was a younger mom, I started seeing that it was affecting their self-esteem in positive ways, that they were feeling much more like grounded and secure in the world around them. And I would even get compliments from people, saying, oh, my gosh, your kids are just so well spoken, or they're so comfortable talking to adults, or they, this or that. And it's like, that wasn't my plan, but it just happened because they felt like they belong in the world and they're okay in the world and they have nothing to fear in the world. And so they put themselves forth in the world. This kind of parenting gives them what they need in order to be well, not just well behaved. And that's the big picture that I didn't see when I was younger, and I didn't care about even when I did see it. But it's still, and even though I think that it might not even be possible for parents of young children to fully have that big picture because it's just, life is so overwhelming and you're in this chapter of your life, I'm still going to tell it to you. I'm still going to tell you the big picture, and hopefully you're going to get it, even though it might be just like something that's waiting for you in the next chapter of your life or something like that. But in order for kids to have that sense of okayness in the world, they need both things. They need loving and emotional attunement, and they need discipline. So, I mean, when you think about it, this shouldn't be this like big mic drop, right? Because like the truth is, like, how easy your kid is to live with, or how much they clean up after themselves or do their chores or use manners or whatever behavioral stuff we're trying to improve with our kids, that kind of doesn't matter in a really weird way because it's temporary. Your kids aren't going to be in your house forever. And if they don't learn these things and they just are like really, wild, unpleasant people to live with, that sucks. But someday they will go off and they'll be bad at doing their laundry and they'll suck at doing their dishes and they'll do all that stuff in their own houses. And eventually they will learn that stuff one way or another. Maybe it's a roommate that teaches it to them. Maybe it's the fact that no one else does it for them. But these are all life skills that people can learn, whether they learn it at age 10 or age 20. So it's not great. It's not pleasant. It really sucks to live with a kid who's poorly behaved. But that is a temporary thing. But their degree of codependency versus security, their sense of self, that's forever. And it's incredibly hard for them to learn it somewhere else or from someone else if they don't get it from us. So discipline is part of what facilitates kids developing that sense of okayness. And that's why boundaries and discipline are just as important as emotional attunement. That's why we keep talking about authoritative parenting, because this might feel counterintuitive to you, but a kid who has an extremely loving, attuned parent, but that parent doesn't really hold boundaries or take control of parenting situations, that kid is just as likely to experience attachment wounding, insecurity, an unhealthy self-concept as the kiddo who was raised in a punitive environment where all they get is discipline and no attunement and stuff like that. So let's look at why that would be. I mean, for goodness sakes, this mom is really emotionally attuned to her child. She's very aware of and attentive to his emotions. She cares how he feels, and she's aware of how she feels. She wants to help him feel safe and relaxed. So why on earth would this kiddo be anxious and dysregulated? And once again, why would we expect a mom who reaches out to a parenting expert for help with her kid's anxiety ever guess that it comes from him needing more discipline? Who could ever blame this mom for not having this on her radar? Okay, so why would this kiddo be anxious and dysregulated? Well, let's look at what's happening inside a kid whose parent doesn't take control of parenting situations and instead puts their kid in charge. I sometimes joke that that's like if I got promoted to president of the United States tomorrow, like I would probably like burst into flames of overwhelm. Like, I can't handle that. I am not ready in any way. Like, it is above my pay grade. I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility or power. Like, my constitution is not developed to the point where it could handle something like that. It's absolutely overwhelming and terrifying. And that is the truth for kids when they are placed in charge. And obviously, let's acknowledge, like, no parent is no parent is intentionally putting their child in charge of nap time or in charge of dinner time. It's just accidentally happening. That's just kind of the dynamic that is developing when parents don't discipline or don't hold boundaries. But nevertheless, that's what's happening internally for this kiddo. Kiddos whose parents don't take charge in healthy, loving ways, it's a scary situation. That sensation that like, well, the grownups aren't taking charge of this situation, so I guess I have to. And weirdly, this can also happen in punitive situations. So for example, like if you have a really dysregulated parent who is, yelling and screaming all the time, or being like reactive in disciplining you in a punitive way and stuff like that, that same sort of rationale can develop inside the child. Well, this maturity and peace and rationality, if I want any of that in this life that I'm living, I'm going to have to bring it, because my parent certainly isn't. And so, right. So these kids in these situations where they don't have boundaries given to them in these, appropriate, healthy ways, when the parent doesn't take charge, what is happening simultaneously for this child is fear, or feeling out of control, feeling dysregulated, feeling anxious. That's like worry and almost panic. And then one of those strategies that it doesn't happen with every kid, but a very common strategy that kids will develop in those out of control, scary situations is to take charge themselves. And so kids who feel out of control often become very controlling and bossy. And kids whose parents don't have that strong leadership and take charge aspect to their parenting, not only can look very bossy, but they can also be really anxiety prone. And so now we can look at this situation with this kiddo and say, listen, this mom is bringing emotional attunement to her parenting times a million. So clearly this kiddo is not struggling with anxiety for lack of emotional attunement from a parent. So let's look at the discipline piece. And it is off, it does need tightening up. And it makes a lot of sense why a kiddo who is in this world where there's no strong, structure. I'm banging on my table. That was just a really stupid way to illustrate something in a audio medium. But when there's nothing that I can come up against, when there's no limit, when the world isn't solid, it makes perfect sense for a kid to feel anxious. Who could blame him? He's 7 years old and he's in charge of his life. That is just awful. Sometimes I don't want to be adulting now, and I'm 46. Like, I definitely did not want to be the adult in the room when I was 7. And, I'm being very sort of like black and white in this story to illustrate a point. Like, this child is safe. He is incredibly loved. He's thriving in a million different ways. We are just looking at this one aspect of this parenting dynamic to illustrate this really, really important point, which is that discipline is so important. So, unlike this mom, I often will get clients who hire me specifically because their kids' behavior is out of control and they are looking at discipline solely from the lens of managing their child's behavior, like I did when I was young. And just as important for permissive parents to get this memo of like discipline is super important because it helps your child to be well. So even if you don't think your child's behavior is out of control, discipline is still really important for your child's wellness. It's just as important for these clients who come to me and they want their kids' behavior to improve. And we're sitting there, in our coaching dynamic and we're thinking like, yes, we're here because we want to get this kid's behavior on track. It's also important for those parents to know, like, actually, your kid's behavior is not the big reason why we want to do this. The big reason why we want to do this is because it's what doing right by our kids means, regardless of the change in behavior that we see. And I would say the same thing is true for this mama. Even if starting to put loving limits and being a little bit more firm and taking charge a little bit more in parenting situations doesn't magically cure her son's anxiety, which it probably won't, that doesn't mean that it's not important for her son to receive that. We really need to look at these kind of like gold standard North Star kind of things in this like huge 30,000 foot level perspective. And this is why I just keep musing around in my mind about, just that sort of messy full circle thing where it's like, we're supposed to do this thing because it's the right thing to do, but we're in the thick of it and life is really hard and complicated. And frankly, I don't even give a crap about any of that stuff. I just want my house to stay clean for 5 minutes, or to be quiet for 5 seconds, or for me to be able to sit down at the dinner table and not get food thrown at me or wind up with yogurt smeared all over my face, right? Like, it's fair that that's all we care about. And it is sometimes really, really beautiful and important to remember, like, you're doing something really major and special and sacred and magical every day of your life when you are striving to parent authoritatively, even those days when you do get yogurt smeared on your face, or you don't get to have a minute of peace because your kids are running around like crazy people and all of that stuff. Even if the behavior in your home or the emotional state of your kids doesn't magically resolve in this, picture perfect way, what you're doing by striving for this kind of parenting is so much bigger than that. It's so much more important than that. I mean, not to get too grandiose, but the ripple effects of raising a well human on this world are immeasurable and enormous. So I want you to just feel that, just feel it right in your solar plexus. I'm sending it out to you right now. And if that's something that you need more than a podcast here and there to remind you of and help you keep on track and actually learn how to implement, and what does it look like to have discipline and healthy boundaries and all of that stuff, you'll know that's what I'm here for. So set up that free consultation with me that you hear me talk about every week. Tell me all about your stuff. Are you struggling with being too punitive and losing your temper? Are you struggling with being too permissive and not taking charge? Are you struggling with your own emotional regulation, which everybody should be saying yes to that question. We all are at times, right? Whatever it is. Or is it struggling with having felt like you've lost yourself in parenting, or you want to be fully yourself in parenting, and all of the things that parenting brings to the table? And by the way, anything that doesn't have to do with parenting, I coach all kinds of people, even though this podcast is just about parenting mostly. Come to that consultation and tell me all about it. I can't wait to hear about it. I can't wait to meet with you, and I can't wait to see how these concepts could completely transform your life. The episode is over, but there's more waiting for you. You can grab my free workbook, Getting Kids to Listen the First Time, that walks you through the fundamental principles I teach all of my clients and applies them to this very universal parenting challenge. So if you're sick of repeating yourself all day long, or just want to learn more about my style, you'll definitely want to go to bit.ly/kidswholisten. And if you're ready to work with me, let's meet. Set up a free call at bit.ly/Kaplan call, and let's create an action plan that gets you exactly where you want to go. And of course, links to all this goodness are in the show notes. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.